In this video, we'll look at what makes these versions of depression different from one another and how there's no clear line between any of them. As I mentioned in the introduction, depression from traumatic experiences or severe life stresses is over here on the mood spectrum. It's sometimes called unipolar to separate it from the bipolar end of the mood spectrum. But they're not really separate from one another. As you go across into the middle of the mood spectrum, there's still depression, much the same as at the unipolar end, but there's something else as well, a higher energy thing. That higher energy thing is called hypomania, but as you'll see in a moment, there are all sorts of hypomania, and some are really subtle. Hypomania comes in a whole range of intensities, from none to extreme. It can come and go for long or short periods of time, and it can be mixed with depression. That's the agitation, irritability kind. So let's look more closely at this hypomania. Here are the different symptoms of hypomania. These symptoms are easiest to recognize when they're extreme, which probably isn't you, because you or someone would have recognized these as manic symptoms by now. So the kind of hypomania that's more likely to be relevant for you is the subtler version, the kind that looks an awful lot like normal human experience.
To understand hypomania, let's look at the extreme form, mania, which again, probably isn't you, but it helps to understand what we're talking about here.
As you can see on this list, the symptoms are extreme and obvious. Can't function, can't sleep, grandiosity that looks like narcissism, and so forth. When these symptoms are more subtle, they look quite different. For people down here on the mood spectrum, hypomania looks more like this. Distractibility, more subtle, just can't read a book, maybe even can't read a magazine. Insomnia, long times waiting to fall asleep or maybe waking up multiple times in the middle of the night. Grandiosity is not grandiose, it's just confidence, like overconfidence, or maybe just a lot of confidence, so that people go off to a social event that they wouldn't usually go to or get more gregarious. Flight of ideas means rapid thinking, and in this form it could be fast and brilliant, or it can be ruminating and obsessive, like obsessive-compulsive disorder. Activity means getting lots of things done, and actually in these more subtle forms of hypomania, people get lots of things done. So it's functional, but it's fast. Speech is talkative, like Chatty Cathy, one of my patients, described herself once. Thoughtless impulsivity, not so much risk here, more like spontaneity, like, hey, let's all go to the beach. Elation is variable. It's like, well, today's a good day. Today's a really good day. Irritability means sharp, harsh, and just getting angry over stuff, getting angry too fast or over minor things. And lastly, the energy thing, well, it's just up, but it's not so far up as to be ridiculous, which it is in the more fully manic form. Now notice, most people have had some or many of these symptoms from time to time. It's just part of normal human experience. But when they're extreme, a bit extreme, and when they occur together, that may be hypomanic. And there are other versions in between those that I've described here. Between hypomania and mania, there's no clear line there. And between hypomania and normal, there's even more subtle versions of hypomania that are really difficult to distinguish from normal human experience. So you can think of mid-mood spectrum depression as depression plus. That's depression plus normal experiences taken to somewhat of an extreme, enough that other people would notice you're not your usual self. Well, you can see the problem here. Yeah, so your insomnia is pretty extreme. Yeah, so you talk a little fast sometimes, or you get irritated way too easily for a while. It's really hard to know whether this is hypomania or not. How are you or anyone supposed to know for sure? And worse, the label bipolar is really misleading. The middle of this spectrum is not really bipolar, not at the way that the far end is. And yet we use the same diagnostic term for the entire range, bipolar 2, bipolar spectrum,
or bipolar NEC, not elsewhere classified in the official rules.
We should call this whole range depression plus some degree of hypomanic-like stuff. And then finally, to make matters worse, different healthcare providers see hypomania differently. For one thing, it really matters how you go about looking. So some see hypomania when others don't see anything at all. That's me there in the Jack Sparrow outfit. Fortunately, there's another way to do this. There are other markers of bipolarity. We'll look at those in the next video. So to summarize this first video, determining what kind of depression do you have is not a this or that thing, a yes or no thing. It's determined by how much hypomania do you have, which is a spectrum thing, a shades of gray thing. But determining how much hypomania you have is tricky because hypomania can be so subtle. So we need some other way of determining what kind of depression you have.